These coordinated attacks was the Christian population of the country who were celebrating the holy day. The radical Muslim militant sect known as Boko Haram claimed responsibility for the attacks. Yesterday's violence comes just a year after a series of similar bombings last Christmas Eve. Since they rose to prominence in 2009, Boko Haram has carried out numerous bloody attacks in its campaign to implement strict Sharia law across Nigeria. The White House strongly condemned the attacks, but what will this violence mean for the region? Joining me now is Fox News contributor Charles Krauthammer. Charles, dozens of Christians dead, mostly those killed on the steps of their church after celebrating Christmas Mass. In other words, Christmas itself was the explicit target here, Charles.
Absolutely, and this is not just restricted to Nigeria. What we're seeing is a worldwide campaign against Christians in lands that are mostly Muslim. Actually, Nigeria is almost 50-50. But look at what's happening to the Copts, meaning the Christians in Egypt. Their churches have been attacked. They themselves have been attacked. We have had the squeezing of Christians out of Iraq for a generation, out of Lebanon. The Lebanese Christians at the end of the Second World War were probably the largest ethnicity in the country, but under relentless pressure from militant Shiites and Sunnis, there's been a huge immigration. And the untold story is the story in the Palestinian territories. Bethlehem, for example, has been almost emptied of its Christians, and the sort of Orwellian reporting in the West has attributed this somehow to Israel, when in fact it's been the rise of militant Islam, Hamas, and other radical sects within the Palestinian territories that have led to a large emigration of Christians from the Palestinian territories as well.
Now, this, as you say, this is a kind of regional de-Christianizing going on. In many places, in parts of the world where Christians and Muslims live together fairly amicably for most of human history. 50 years ago, Nigeria lived under common law. Now half of it lives under Sharia. If you lived in the surviving Christian half of Nigeria, would you take a long-term bet that you wouldn't also be living under Sharia in a couple of decades' time?
I would be getting my visa papers ready and prepared to emigrate. Look what's happened in a country that was also split the same way, north and south. Sudan, where the north was Arab and Muslim and the south was animist and Christian. And for a generation, the Arab north conducted a savage war against the animists and the Christians in the south, which has resulted in the end in the division of the country into two. But it's what Samuel Huntington, the great historian and political theorist, wrote 20 years ago, when he wrote that the borders of Islam are bloody, meaning that with the rise of radical Islam, as you say, Steve, in places that for centuries Christians and Muslims and others had lived together, with the rise of radical Islam, this idea of just attacking the Christians not only as a strategic and political act to seize their territory, but simply as an act of intolerance, has risen dramatically. And you see it in the Philippines, you see it in Indonesia, you see it all around essentially the borders of Islam, wherever radical Muslim populations are up against the other. And that's what we see happening all over the world.
Now, just to pick up that phrase about Islam's bloody borders, the Samuel Huntington phrase, how big a part of this story is the silence of the West? By most accounts, the Christian population of Iraq fell by 2/3 between 2003 and 2011. In other words, the Christian population of Iraq collapsed and was forced to flee on America's watch. In a sense, that's not just a problem with radical Islam. That says something about our will and our determination to stand up to this too, doesn't it?
I think that's right. And look at how the Catholic Church has been in a quandary, for example, over the pressure on the Maronites, the Christian Maronites in Lebanon. They don't want to anger the local regime, which of course has the power. So they try to find some accommodation. But rather than speak very loudly and clearly about the oppression of the Christians. They try to do quiet diplomacy behind the scenes, and it simply doesn't work. But the most important thing, I think, is this. We tend to blame, particularly some on the right, like the Ron Pauls, and some on the left, radical Islamic terrorism and attacks on Western actions, Western provocations, imperialism, and the rest. There is no Western provocation in Nigeria. There was no Western provocation in Sudan. This is an expression of an exclusive, militant wing of a religion that will not tolerate anything other. What we don't remember, a few months before 9/11, the radical regime in Afghanistan went out into the desert. And what did it do? It destroyed, it blew up two 1,500-year-old magnificent Buddhist structures, statues. The Buddhists aren't imperialists. They are not capitalists. They are not Christians. They're not oppressors. It was a rejection of the other. In a sense, they have to cleanse the world of infidels and any reflection of infidel culture. And that's what we see in radical Islam, and we see it again at the borders in the most horrific way.
When the Kingdom of Egypt was set up in 1922, I think the first or second finance minister was a Jew. There are no Jews in Egypt now in any number, never mind in the Egyptian cabinet, and we sort of accept that as a permanent feature of life. There are no Jews in Egypt. The Jewish population in Baghdad is down to half a dozen, I believe. Mm-hmm. Will we soon, a generation hence, accept the fact that there are no longer Christians in Egypt, there are no longer Christians in Iraq, and that's just a fact of life too?
I think what you said is right. The West will acquiesce. You know, people speak about the Nakba, the tragedy of the Arabs, Palestinians in the 48 War of Independence, where Israel established its independence against the 5 Arab armies who invaded it. What people don't remember, that in those years, Jews who lived in Egypt longer than Arabs, longer than Islam even existed, were essentially expelled from Iraq, expelled and hanged in Iraq in the squares of Baghdad, expelled from Syria, Lebanon, etc., where they had lived for over 2,000 years. And as they say, you start with the Jews, who were, of course, alone, vulnerable. You end up with others, and now it's the Christians. This, in its more extreme elements, Islamic radicalism is intolerant of other religions, and we saw it this terrible weekend at its most extreme manifestation in Nigeria.
Thanks a lot, Charles Glumthorpe, for this Christmas Day.